When learning a foreign language, some things might appear weird or even stupid. But does a negative attitude towards Chinese make it harder to learn? And if it does, how can you adopt a more positive approach? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about attitude and how we think about learning Chinese. This matters, so if you think that Chinese is fascinating and exciting, you will not just be more likely to keep learning, but you will also learn more during the time you are actually studying the language. Compare this with thinking that Chinese is weird and stupid. This will not only make you more likely to quit, it will also make sure you have a miserable time before you quit. I think it's safe to say that most students who start learning Chinese have a positive attitude towards the language. This might be one of the key reasons we chose to learn Chinese rather than some other language. As we start out, progress is also more visible. We can feel that we can do more this week with the language than we could the previous week, and this is motivating. And even though I think there are people who might have had Chinese forced upon them somehow, I still think this is rather rare, and most students do have a positive attitude when they start. There are, of course, also fascinating things about the Chinese language, and you tend to pay attention to some of these that are extra interesting. For example, I remember learning the word for cinema, 电影院, and remembering it as building of electric shadows, which felt very poetic and suitable. I think very few people can keep this positive and somewhat innocent attitude towards learning Chinese, though. So when we reach an intermediate or advanced level, we have probably changed the reason why we're learning. Well, there could be a long-term goal that is still relevant, but we're no longer learning Chinese because we think that word formation is cool or because characters are interesting. We might still think those things, but that is not enough to make us feel excited in our everyday studying. Long-term motivation and how to make sure you keep it is something we've talked about several times on the podcast, and I will provide some links in the show notes to articles where you can read more about this. As we keep learning, we also realize that some things maybe weren't as easy as we thought, or some things that seemed quaint or a bit weird when we started turn out to be really annoying, and we start thinking that Chinese isn't fascinating and exciting, it's weird and stupid. Why oh why didn't Chinese end up with a phonetic alphabet rather than a needlessly complex logographic writing system? And while tones are fun to learn, they can also be very annoying, especially if you practice them for a long time and still don't hear the difference between two words. And while Chinese grammar seems to be super easy when you start out, the more you learn, the more you realize that where you put those small l or the other particles or aspect markers is actually not that easy and feels completely arbitrary at times. I think most of us oscillate back and forth along the attitude spectrum. I'm usually rather positive about learning and teaching Chinese, but I sometimes also feel frustrated by some of the things I just mentioned. For example, I still mix up characters that have the same pronunciation and similar meaning sometimes, and this is annoying. If Chinese just had a phonetic writing system, this wouldn't be a problem. But then again, if Chinese didn't have Chinese characters, maybe I wouldn't have started learning Chinese in the first place either. Ultimately, I think it's very important to note that Chinese is the way it is, and we can only choose how we approach it or our attitude towards this, or we can at least try to influence our attitude, whereas it is almost impossible to have any impact at all on the Chinese language itself. We as students might think that characters are annoying to write, or maybe that tones are hard to hear, but that won't change anything. The tones and characters are here to stay, and what we can choose is how we deal with them. As mentioned, this matters for many reasons. Having a positive attitude means we have a better time when we're studying, we will probably learn more, and we will also stick to learning Chinese longer than people who have a more negative attitude. There's a substantial amount of research looking at how attitude influences language learning, but there are also a few things that make this research hard to interpret or hard to apply to specific cases, such as your own when you're learning Chinese. For example, what do we mean by attitude, and towards what language? It might be different if we're looking at research into second language learners of English compared to people who learn Chinese as a second language. And what about attitude not towards the language itself, but towards societies and cultures where this language is used? And whose attitude anyway? Are we talking about children, adolescents, adults? Are we talking about people who live in the country in which the language is spoken, or people who learn it at home? In general, attitude matters, but mostly indirectly. It's not necessarily that a student who likes learning Chinese and has a more positive attitude will learn more for every minute they engage with the language, but rather that this student is much more likely to invest more time, and of course spending more time is important if you want to learn. Also, as mentioned earlier, if you have a negative attitude towards the Chinese language, you're more likely to quit, and if you quit learning, then it goes without saying that you will learn less. This is an important factor that's often overlooked in much research, because if you just take two groups and you set them to do something for a set amount of time and you compare the results, you miss the fact that in real world your study time isn't fixed. It's not like you spend 1 hour a day learning Chinese no matter what your attitude is. It's rather the case that if you have a positive attitude, you will spend more than an hour, and if you have a very negative attitude, maybe you will not study at all. So the time you spend here is important, which is something we talked more about in episode 203 when we talked about the 3 factors that determine how much Chinese you learn. This means that one of your most important tasks as an independent learner of Mandarin is to find interesting and enjoyable ways of learning and try to minimize or get rid of those that you don't enjoy and can't stand doing for longer periods of time. One thing you should do is to try to adopt a positive attitude towards learning Chinese and thinking of the language as being fascinating and exciting whenever you can, and stop thinking about it as being weird and stupid. Attitude is, after all, something that's entirely in our heads. It is not about what the Chinese language is actually like, so what we choose to think about it is completely up to us. So, for example, instead of thinking of Chinese characters as being weird and stupid, you can think of them as being beautiful fragments of a living history. Learning characters is also a great playground to explore memory and memory techniques, and I've learned a lot about this simply by learning Chinese characters. So the Chinese writing system isn't unnecessary or so complex that it can't be mastered, it's just different. Next, learning the sounds of Mandarin opens up a rich world of sound you didn't know existed before. And this is perhaps particularly true if Mandarin is the first foreign language you learn. Learning to pronounce or hear the difference between new sounds can, of course, take a lot of time and effort, but it's also rewarding, and suddenly you start hearing things that you simply weren't able to hear before. Tones are not unnecessary, they're simply to annoy you as a student, and people don't speak Mandarin differently in different regions just to make it hard for you. Instead, it's a rich world waiting to be explored. And to expand that point to culture and society, which is of course particularly true if you live in a Chinese-speaking environment, other people do things differently. They don't do it in a worse way or in a bad way. They just do them in a way that you aren't used to, and seeing the patterns here and understanding why people do what they do and how they think about that is an interesting journey in and of itself. The point here is not to make learning Chinese sound more interesting or easier than it actually is. It's just that what we think about language, culture, and society is largely up to us. Given that we have a choice, I think we should do our best to adopt a positive attitude, because it will probably mean that we'll learn more and we'll enjoy the journey a lot more as well. Now, this doesn't mean that Chinese is never weird or stupid. This does happen sometimes. But when you encounter these examples, think for a moment about how weird and stupid your language is. I'm going to use English as an example here because you as a listener presumably understand English and I've learned it as a second language. Much fun has of course been poked at English for being irregular or weird, and Richard Lederer is probably one of the most well-known authors who do this. In English, a slim chance and a fat chance are the same, but a wise man and a wise guy are opposites. Overlook and oversee are opposites, quite a lot and quite a few are alike. The weather is hot as hell one day and cold as hell the next. And let's not discuss English spelling. Or grammar for that matter. Imagine learning English as a native speaker of Chinese. There are so many difficult things you need to care about that are so easy in Chinese. What's the big deal with articles, for example? And why do we have to inflect verbs? And why do we have plurals? Or why is there so much redundancy in general? I mean, if I say she likes red, do we really need to inflect the verb there? We know it's third person from she already, so this is entirely redundant. Or, while we're at the topic, why make such a big difference between he and she? Why can't we just have one word for it? Ta? Anyway, the point here is that it's meaningless to point at another language and say, haha, look how stupid that is, because your language will appear to be equally stupid when people try to learn it. Another thing I've noticed with some beginners is that they ask the wrong type of questions. Essentially, you should ask basic questions, but you should not question the basics. You should be particularly careful with why questions, because these are often asked not because you want to know the answer, but you feel frustrated by the phenomenon in question. Here are some example questions that I've heard from beginners. Why are there so many difficult characters? Or why are there so many characters? Why don't they use tenses the way we do? Why don't the Chinese use an alphabet like everybody else? Why are there so many synonyms for everything? Why are there tones in Mandarin? Some of these questions have answers, but they are not going to help you learn Chinese as a beginner or even intermediate or advanced student, and the answers tend to be book length, not something a teacher can tell you in one sentence. So when I say that you should ask basic questions, not question the basics, I mean that you can obviously ask questions that have simple answers, like what does this mean, or how do I say this, but not why does Chinese have characters. There might be answers to these why questions, of course, but they are not going to help you as a learner, and as I said, these questions often aren't asked because the student really wants to know the answer, but rather to express frustration. So as a student, explore and learn, savor the differences, and then if the why questions really persist when you've been learning Chinese for a while, by all means go ahead and research them. So to conclude this episode, learning Chinese takes a lot of time, and if we adopt a positive attitude, it will be easier to invest that time and you will also enjoy learning Chinese. When your basic attitude is positive, open, and curious, you will also find it easier to deal with some setbacks that will inevitably come. If you already think that Chinese is weird and stupid, a major setback might make you quit. My goal in this episode wasn't to hide the difficult or frustrating aspects of learning Chinese, but rather to show that what you think about them matters. And you're not going to change the way Chinese works, you're not going to be able to get rid of characters or tones, but the way you think about them will impact how much you learn and how much you enjoy learning Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.